I'd like to call the meeting to order. Welcome to the first meeting of Corporate Service Committee. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings and information upon request. To make a request for any city services, please contact accessibility@london.ca, or you can call at 519-661-2489, extension 2425. And to make a request specific to this meeting, please contact csc@london.ca. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, we'll call the election of vice chair for the term ending November 30th of 2020. Are there any interests or any nominations on the floor?
I'm happy to put my name forward, Madam Chair.
Any other interests? Can I get a mover for this motion? Councillor Morgan will move it. Do we have a seconder? Mayor Ed Halter. I will call to vote.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 6-0.
Thank you. So now we'll move to the consent items. Are there any items that need to be pulled separately, or can we move them all together? I look to committee, none. Okay, can I get a motion to move all three items together? Councillor Hopkins, can I get a seconder? Councillor Morgan, we'll call to vote. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I didn't want to pull any of these items, but I do want to comment on 2.2. I think this is a good step forward. I know it's part of the overall review, and there's a lot of actions that come out of that, and I think this is an important step forward. I just want to recognize the staff for the work that they've done to get it in front of us. It looks like a good direction to me. I think it's going to be helpful, and it's also happening very quickly, frankly, in response to the review. I think you have to take your time to make sure that it's right, but also I think moving with some urgency is important too, and just wanted to say thank you to the staff who worked on this particular policy.
Thank you. I did forget to call comments and questions. I apologize. It's my first meeting, so bear with me. Yes, Mayor Ed Halter.
Yeah, thanks. Feels funny to discuss after I voted, but I've already voted to accept, but I was going to echo the comments of the Deputy Mayor to Mr. Cox said to your team and to everyone that's been involved in putting together the respectful workplace policy. I think that it really takes the recommendations that had come to us, and I think that there's very strong emphasis in the right places. So I know you'll pass on our appreciation to all the parties that, because this truly is a whole of municipal government approach that we're taking with this. So we're anticipating that we'll not only just get great cooperation from every department, but I think it really puts forward, I think, what needs to be done to ensure that this is a workplace that not only people want to come to, but they know that they can feel safe in this work environment, and in the spirit of the title of it, be respected for who they are and what they do. So kudos and appreciation as well.
Any other comments or questions? Councillor Van Hulst.
Thank you. Yeah, so the policy talks about prohibited behavior and lumps the discrimination, harassment, and reprisal, which are things that are already would be illegal, and adds disrespectful behavior, which is, of course, something we hope not to see here at City Hall, where professionalism is the order of the day, and what we see every day here as well.
Any other comments or questions? Should we call to vote?
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 6-0.
So there are no scheduled items, and we have one item for direction. However, it's also in our confidential agenda, so I wanted to see if committee wanted to go to the confidential meeting first, and then we can vote on it after. Would that be okay? So do we have to do a mover for it? Okay, so we'll get a motion to go to closed session. Councillor Van Holst, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. We'll call to vote. So we're going to go into our confidential meeting in Committee Room 3, and that would be for all the items on the confidential agenda, and then we'll come back to finish the item for direction from there, and we'll adjourn from there.
Chair, if I can just acknowledge, you're incredibly efficient. I'm just thinking of the last chair we had. I mean, honest to goodness, it's brilliant, you know.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 6-0.
All right, so we will resume the public session, and I will ask the Vice Chair to report progress.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to report progress on items 6.1 to 6.3.
So now we'll go to the items for direction, which is the item 4.1, issuance of proclamation policy. And I would like to switch with the Vice Chair to be able to comment on this as well. Are there any, I don't know if we should move a motion first and second it, or we should take comments and questions. We'll do a discussion first, and then we'll call to questions after.
Councillor Carabanga.
Apologies, just point of order. Is there a staff report first, or are we just going to go into Q&A?
It's just what's on the agenda. We don't have a presentation.
There's no presentation, I understand. Is the committee requesting remarks from the staff? Okay, well then, Councillor Carabanga, if you'd proceed.
Thank you, Presiding Chair. So I'd just like to make a few comments on this proclamation issuance policy. And I know that the report says that we just received the report from staff, but I would ask my colleagues not to do that. For the reasons being that the community has been, this has been a discussion for a while now. It's been a couple of months since we've been talking about proclamation policies, and we've gotten a lot of support from the community. The community is well aware that this is ongoing, and they've been asking, and I think it felt like they had been waiting for a time where proclamations would be issued again at the City of London. And these are different partners in our community. We've received communications from the Pride Committee, from the Women's, ANOVA had sent a letter, LOC sent a letter, Pillars to Non-for-Profit sent a letter, London Black History Committee sent a letter. We received a lot of communications from different groups from the community, and the Muslim community as well sent a letter of support of having proclamations be issued in the City of London. And the purpose of the policy is to provide a way and to encourage the public awareness and provide recognition for events and activities that are significant to the residents of London. And so I don't see how this is a negative thing to do. And that being said, I'm fully aware of what's happened and what's transpired in the past, and how that was a risky situation. But we can also learn from other cities that are doing it. For example, the city of Ottawa recently went through a problem where they received a complaint or a protest for issuing something that wasn't with the guidelines of the community, and the mayor was able to get ahead of it and amend the policy as they went. And I think that we can find a way to have a very defined and clear context in which we can provide these recognition to our community, and as well as have it reflect our strategic plan as a city and the values on which we stand on as a City of London. And we can have, it's very clear, and there are so many other cities that are doing it, and I don't think that when we want to fix something, we just ignore it by not doing it at all. I think that, like any other service, if we offer a service and things just don't go the way that we had planned, we have to come up with better practices on how to respond to that. And I in my opinion, just receiving it and closing it and moving forward with not doing, the current policy says that we do not provide any proclamations, does not send out a good message, especially to a policy that came into place because it violated human rights. So if we want to overturn that, we have to come up as a city with a way that we can provide these proclamations in an inclusive way, in a safer way, where nobody's feeling excluded. And we can also learn from other cities that are doing it. The city of Toronto is doing it, the city of Brampton is doing it, the city of Kingston is doing it, the city of Ottawa is doing it. There's so many other cities that we can learn from and different practices that they're using that we can learn from to be able to do the same thing in London. I don't think that not doing it to protect ourselves is a good enough practice. Staff, I thank you for the report you brought forward, and I appreciate the time and effort that you put in this, and I understand the need to protect the City of London, and to make sure that we do not end up in a very awkward situation that is awkward for the council and that is also awkward for the staff. But I think that we can all work together to figure this out and to find a way that works for the City of London, to find a way where we can have proclamations that pertain to the municipal matters and to our community and our strategic plan, because we already have pillars in our strategic plan that provides a clear guidance on what is acceptable in the City of London and what is not acceptable. So I will encourage my colleagues to please defeat this report, the motion to just receive. And I think that Councillor Helmer and I would be able to put a motion on the table after that. Thank you.
Okay, well, there's no motion on the table yet. However, Deputy Mayor Helmer has requested to speak.
Thank you. First, I want to recognize the work that the staff have done to get it in front of us now. So if we are going to make some changes, we actually have time to do that in advance of February. And I know that there's a lot of things underway, and turning around these things takes time and focus, and it takes attention off other things. And I just want to appreciate that. I do think it's good that we got the report now, because essentially what's being recommended is like, don't change anything. And I think that that is not what we should do here. I do think there's a way we can provide the service of proclamations to the community without doing it in a discriminatory way that's going to get us into trouble. You know, I think that that's something we can do. We provide a lot of services in the community, and I think that's everyone's expectation, is that we don't discriminate when we're providing those services. So what I would like to suggest, because we do have a corporate services committee meeting in January, which I think would be in time to be able to do something for February still, if we were to make a change at the January 6th meeting of corporate services committee, go to council, it could be in place for February. And so I think we'd still be on track for proclaiming Black History Month, for example, as one of the things that could be proclaimed, is to have our staff report back essentially with a policy that's similar to what they're doing in Toronto. There's a whole bunch of cities that have different proclamation policies. Toronto is issuing a lot of proclamations, and they don't seem to get into trouble about how they're doing it. So they seem to have a lot of incoming requests. They're issuing a lot of proclamations. It seems to not be controversial. Their policy seems to be withstanding a lot of activity, is what I'm suggesting. And I think if we have that in front of us, we can then decide in January, do you want to go ahead with this, or do you want to leave it the same? Like personally, I don't want to leave it the same. I can understand some people's apprehensions around it, but I think we need to have an alternative in front of us. I will say there's one part of the way Toronto does it, which I'm not totally sold on, which is a lot of it is at the discretion of the mayor. And it's certainly nothing personal with our mayor, but I think putting the discretion solely at the feet of the mayor is potentially a weakness, and maybe we want to have it resting somewhere else. So I think having it come back with something similar to Toronto would be good. I do think having it be delegated so that it's not like a whole council decision every time we have a proclamation, from an efficiency perspective, is very smart. I do think it needs to be delegated somewhere. But I think that that would be an appropriate way of proceeding, is to have a revised draft policy similar to Toronto come forward in January, and then we can have a discussion there. I think it also would give the community something to look at and say, because there's nothing in front of us now, where they can say, okay, is that going to work for us? Do we like that policy approach, or do we have problems with it? Because I think we're going to have to get community feedback on whatever the new policy is. And if we're targeting January, everyone knows that there'll be a discussion, then they can go look at what Toronto is doing now, so they can kind of get a sense of that direction. So that's what I would suggest as a motion, is to have our staff report back with a revised policy that's similar to the City of Toronto. And then we can have a debate about that in January and decide how to proceed at that point.
All right, thank you. So that's a motion moved by Deputy Mayor Helmer, and I presume Councillor Karabagi, you second that motion? Okay. So then we'll move on with discussion regarding this item. Councillor Lewis, Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Presiding Officer. Colleagues, it's an interesting discussion, and I'm weighing in here as a member of the community that was discriminated against back in the 90s by then Mayor Haskett, and actually had to have the Human Rights Commission review the situation. And I look at how far the LGBT community has come in this city over the last, well, nearly 3 decades now that I've called it home, which is starting to date me by age, which is still younger than his worships. But nonetheless, we've come all that distance without proclamations. And I understand why organizations like to have a fancy piece of paper with the seal on it that they can display at an event or such a thing. But when I read through the report, when I look at the realities of the fact that this exposes the city to legal risks, that it has the potential to actually divide the community over contentious issues, and that we have actually many tools at our fingertips already with council recognitions, with certificates that we do. And I have to say, you know, the mayor has been very generous about making sure that for activities that are happening in a councillor's ward, that councillor is co-signing the certificate with the mayor so that it's being recognized that way. And I prefer, frankly, us keeping this with having councillors do the recognitions before council meetings. I think it places a level of accountability on us, not on staff. I think it actually means more to the community as a whole if myself, as an LGBT Londoner, is able to recognize Pride Month, or if Councillor Kayabaga, as a Black woman, is able to recognize Black History Month, or if Councillor Morgan is able to recognize an event at the university as an educator. I think that there's a value in the personal connections that we can bring to these events and recognitions as councillors that supersedes a piece of paper with a stamp on it, that has the potential to create more controversy. I'm also concerned, one of the things that's missing from the report here, Toronto has done over 150 of these things annually. So first of all, I question if that volume doesn't actually diminish the value in the first place, but I start to wonder about how much staff time is going to have to be put into vetting and issuing these things, especially if we delegate it, which I'm not really comfortable with, because we can delegate it to staff, but whatever decision staff may make, we as councillors ultimately end up wearing that decision. And if that decision goes wrong, that at the end of the day is on us, not on our staff. So I actually think we should receive this report and not take any further action on it, because I think as councillors, we actually have a responsibility to step up more and recognize those events and activities that are important in our community. We have council meetings that go by without any recognitions. We could have recognitions every week. There's always something going on in the city. We could have proclamations. We could have proclamations every week from the mayor. If you start looking at the events that happen on a calendar annually, you know, a day of action for this, a day of action for that, it's not hard to find 365 of those. You could literally do something every day of the calendar year if you really sought it out. So I think it's more meaningful when we as individuals bring things forward that we think are really worthy of recognition. You know, I worked as a federal staffer prior to this life here at council. And when members had the opportunity in the House of Commons to rise and make member statements, I know that that meant a lot more to the constituents in that riding than it meant to have, you know, an MP wearing a ribbon in the House, or a proclamation by the Prime Minister. When the individual MP stood up and said, this is an important thing happening in my community, that meant so much more to those individuals. And so I appreciate where this is coming from, because we want to celebrate the great things that are happening in our community, the great people who are in our community. But I think we already have the tools to do that. And I think we're actually just, in this case, we're trying to fix a problem that we don't actually have, because we have other ways to recognize individuals, events, groups of people, communities of various demographics. So the chair is giving me my time's up sign, so I will leave it at that and see where else the discussion goes.
Thank you. I will take the opportunity to hear from Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, and I want to thank staff. This report came back to us very quickly, and I do appreciate that. I read the report. I understand there's other opportunities for us to do recognitions, a council, a flag policy, illumination policy. We have a number of events that are always listed on the City of London's website. We are doing things in the city, but when I read this report, I was really not aware that we did not have anything. And I think when it comes to proclamations, it makes a lot of us feel uncomfortable. I know there's challenges, the risk is there to the city. But I also think that we've learned some lessons. Not doing anything makes me also feel uncomfortable. And when I hear from Councillor Kaubaga saying there is a community interest in at least looking at it and seeing, can we revisit this? Can we look at it with different eyes 23 years later? I have a hard time saying no to that. To me, it's that simple. I think I'm not that well versed in what Toronto is doing, but having a look at best practices, maybe even having a look at policies and how everything can come together and strengthening everything, it's worth a look at. It's an opportunity, and I don't want to say no to it. So I think will be interesting to see what comes back, and looking forward to continuing the conversation. And thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
Thanks very much. Obviously, whatever the direction of council ultimately is, we will, that will be respected. I'm mindful when the suggested amendment references Toronto. When this was being considered, I've heard some feedback from some councillors saying, well, why would we not have a prescriptive list, for example, like the federal government has, which would cover certain holidays, or pardon me, certain special events. This is not about holidays, but certain special events and special groups. And I respect that. But when I look at what Toronto has, they have, of the 180 proclamations to date this year, only 19 were on the federal list. That suggests to me that there were, to date, 161 that were not, which would then have to have additional levels of scrutiny. So to come back to some of the comments that Councillor Lewis indicated, when we look at the cost associated with doing the research for compliance, the other concern I would have is it certainly opens this up to groups that may wish to have proclamations, and when they declare that that somehow they've been prejudiced against because they did not get a proclamation, then that will take additional staff and potentially legal time to deal with that, whether these groups are legitimate or not. So perhaps I could just ask staff, because I'm trying to get an understanding of where we are with this. I know all we've done is make declarative statements as opposed to seek the view of staff, but staff have put this together in good faith and based on past experience and current experience. So there is an amendment that's talking to the issue of Toronto. So perhaps, Chair, through you, I could ask staff, beyond what's in this information sheet with respect to Toronto, what is it that we know about either their success rate or their litigious rate on proclamations? Do we have any sense of that?
Mr. Montier? Are you?
Thank you. Through the chair, I'll defer to the city clerk, who has more information on the specifics of the Toronto policy.
Thank you. Ms. Saunders?
Through Mr. Vice Chair, I believe the question was what we knew about whether there had been any issues with the City of Toronto and whether they had any legal actions against them, either through the human rights or other. We did not research that. So we can certainly take a look at, reach out to Toronto and Ottawa and others and ask any legal challenges that they've had. We didn't look at that specifically.
So Chair, just carrying on then, I'm also mindful of the investment of staff time associated with this. I don't know how many requests for proclamations that we have had historically. We are not Toronto, who seems to be the largest number. Well, coming up, I guess Edmonton is fairly close as well. Edmonton being a community larger than London, but again, that was in the 180 range. Do you have any, is there any sense, has there been any thought put to this through you, Chair, to, I suppose it would be the clerk, what kind of investment of staff time this would be to review these? And I'm respectful, because we're trying to get all the information that we will ultimately need when staff come back, if that's the desire of committee and council.
Okay, thank you. So if staff can describe what the staff resources might be for policy like this.
Through Mr. Vice Chair, it is quite well known in the community that the City of London does not do proclamations. So the number of requests for proclamations we've had is very minimal because there's an awareness. We do requests for community flags and lighting of the buildings. We have very many that come through that are dealt with by our staff. So there's quite a few. You'll notice that in City of Toronto and some of the other municipalities that have very many proclamation questions, that they actually have a dedicated staff person that does just that. So that would be likely because we need to vet and make sure that the organization that is asking for the proclamation meets policy. So I'm not suggesting that would be in our case, but it does take time to do some research on some of the organizations. I personally, as my time here as clerk, ran into a problem with one such issue. So I am very aware of the time that it takes, and then sometimes you miss things about an organization that can cause problems and cause an embarrassment to the municipality, and I experienced that myself with my own decision.
Well, then just as a follow-up to that, I know that we have many ways that we celebrate and honor great organizations and great events. I'm trying to get a sense what we get out of a proclamation that we don't get out of all the various recognitions that we provide, and through individual councillors, through council itself. I'm trying to get a sense of whether it's worth the, I'll say, reputational risk and financial risk associated, implications associated with this. I'm not even sure how I would direct that, if that might be more opinion than not that I'm looking for. But Chair, if staff wants to try to tackle that, I'm just trying to put that on the table. In terms of reputational risk, if we get, all you need to do is get one wrong. And that, so the Toronto experience may well be very interesting, but if that's the basis on which we are going to consider our own policies, and it's not a prescribed list, it's a broad list, it feels to me like we're rolling the dice on what Toronto's experience is. That might be great, but then I would caution about the issues around reputational and ultimately reputational risk and financial cost. Through you, Chair.
Okay.
Sorry, we were talking. I apologize.
So I believe the mayor is hoping to find out what advantages we might have in making proclamations when we're facing both financial and reputational risks.
So, Mr. Vice Chair, I'm not comfortable answering that question. That would be an opinion, and I'm staff. I don't have opinions on that.
Okay. Well, thank you. And then if I may, perhaps I'll go to Councillor Morgan, who's next on the speaker's list, and followed by Councillor Kaibaga and Councillor Lewis.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to say a couple words on this. I'm really open to my colleagues' thoughts, but in approaching the proclamation policy, I'm very conscious of how we got to this point. We have a member of council who's looking to provide an enhanced and meaningful way to recognize a very important event in the City of London. And through the course of that investigation, the idea of revisiting the proclamation policy was raised. And so I'm not surprised that there's a number of community organizations and groups that would be interested in supporting a proclamation policy. It's a new and exciting way to recognize your event that hasn't been around for a while that might come back. So obviously people are going to step up and say, sure, I'd like to do that. When we had the new and exciting way to hand out money with the municipal accommodation tax, guess what? Everybody had a great idea on wanting to access those funds. So I think that's a very natural approach. My worry with the proclamation policies, which is just yet another tool of recognizing, important and significant events in the city, is that there's a risk of issuing a proclamation and thinking that you've done enough on an event. You issue the proclamation, you check the box, you hand out the certificate with the seal on it, and that's great. And I think that gets away from providing real substance to the recognitions that we're trying to contemplate in a meaningful way. When we declared a climate emergency, we could have said, that's great, we've declared an emergency, mission accomplished for us, but we backed that up with actual meaningful action and a report that actually that took specific targets and actions to make that meaningful. So for me, given how we got here, as a suggestion that this is one of the tools that we could use, I still don't think us creating a new proclamation policy gets to the heart of providing really meaningful and enhanced recognitions of the important events that we think need recognition. I know Councillor Lewis talked about the way that Pride has been elevated over a number of years. Proclamation would have been a tool to provide a way to recognize that, but it wouldn't have created all of those things that have happened over the past 2 decades with pretty much every elected official being willing to march in the parade or to attend events or to share information on social media or to recognize it in a much more enhanced way than simply issuing a proclamation. So for me, I'm not sure that the proclamation is the right tool to accomplish the goals of providing really meaningful recognition of important events and dates and groups. So I'm not sure if I'm interested in keeping, pursuing this and having our staff work on it. I'd rather return to the original discussion of, listen, we got events we want to provide some enhanced recognition to. We want to do meaningful things with it. How do we do that in a really meaningful way? And I'm just not convinced at this point that the proclamation tool and bringing that back is the right way to do that. But again, I'm open to hearing my colleagues' thoughts and on this debate. But that's kind of where I stand, given how I've seen this proceed so far.
Thank you very much. I'll go to you, Councillor Kaibaga.
Thank you, Presiding Chair. So I just kind of wanted to comment on some of the things that we're discussing here and my colleagues have mentioned. I know that Councillor Lewis has mentioned something about, if you're here and I'm here, then we can do the proclamations ourselves. But I find that, and with all due respect, a little short-sighted, because we're not always going to be here. And what happens when we're not here? And if we're talking about this today, I'm not sure if the last council or other councils have brought this forward in the past. If they've tried to do proclamations in the past, and for whatever reasons that they've tried to do proclamations in the past. one of the reasons why we're here today on this proclamation discussion was it was brought up through the report and the plan on what we were going to do around Black History Month. And as staff did, canvass different community members, they did identify that a proclamation from the City of London would be an important and a significant one for the Black History, for the Black community in London, for a lot of reasons, for different reasons that they've identified. We have gone through a lot of hate crimes in the City of London, and proclamations are supposed to be a moment to educate, to bring awareness to different things that are in our community that we don't get to do very often. If we go to our strategic plan, we look back at our strategic plan and what we want to do in our community. We want to make sure that we are inclusive and that we're driven by community. And if the community is requesting that we proclaim or we recognize this community because there has been problems that are related to the City of London not recognizing that this community in our larger community as a collective, I don't see why we would be opposed to that. I do not understand why we would be opposed to providing a recognition because, and I understand where you were going with that, and I actually agree with it. I've thought about doing it myself, but what happens 2 years from now if I'm not elected again, or if I'm not here, or there isn't any other, person of your community or my community? There's only two of us on this council, and there's only one of you on this council. So what happens when no one's present? So there's no one to recognize that specific community just because there isn't a counselor who can relate and who can want to recognize that community. So I find that with a lot of respect, it was a very good, I could see where you're going with that thinking, but I also find it to have some loopholes because we're not always going to be here. I don't know for other people, but I don't want to be here for the next 25 years so I can be able to proclaim Black History Month or any other group that I may belong to. So I think having a policy, that's why we put policies in place to make sure that they become inclusive for everyone. Anyone can get up here and proclaim anything they want to proclaim, and it's with good intention and it's good. But when we put policies in place, is to ensure that in the future we are offering the same level of care to every single person in our community. So, and I understand the concerns around some problems that will arise, that may arise. I strongly believe that we have a very good staff, very smart staff. We have very capable council that will be able to go over those challenges. And yes, it could be embarrassing for the City of London, but I think it's also embarrassing for us to refuse to do proclamations out of fear. We are an innovative city, we're growing, and the City of Toronto has 150 proclamations. I don't think we're gonna get to that number. We are not the City of Toronto. The City of Toronto has over 1 million people living there. We're still at 400 or 300,000 people in the City of London. So I doubt that we're gonna have that same issue. I don't think that we will get to a place where we need to have an office or a specific staff just doing proclamations, because there are other cities that are doing it through the clerk's office and not have a specific new staff or hired staff to just take care of proclamations. So I honestly, truly understand the concerns that my colleagues have, but just like any other difficult decisions that we've had to make, this is important in our community. The community has asked for it. And I don't know if my colleague, Councillor Lewis, has been able to receive the communication from the Pride Committee. They've asked, and everyone has asked, that we look at this and we bring this awareness. It's educational, it's awareness, and it shows good faith from on the part of the City of London, and it teaches people on what's happening in our community and where we need to bridge and connect different communities that are in our collective community. Thank you. My time is up, so.
Thank you. So then to you, Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Presiding Officer, and through you to my colleague, I certainly appreciate where you're coming from with this item too. I genuinely do. And I don't intend to be here in 25 years carrying the flag either. I hope to be retired by then. perhaps lounging around my pool with a cold beverage in my hand, but not at this time of year, though. I'll wait till warmer weather. But to that point, I did want to share with colleagues, I don't have to look very far back. I can look back to January of 2018, before this council was constituted, and we did not have an open member of the LGBTQ community on this council, but I believe it was, and I could be wrong, so if I am, I apologize, but I believe it was actually Councillor Morgan, when I came forward as a community member, after the former mayor had issued an apology for the history around this particular item, actually, asking that council actually support that apology and endorse it itself, because to me, as a member of that community, it wasn't just the mayor, it was the council of the day that erred in this situation. And so there's opportunities always for communities to find champions on council, I think, to bring things forward if they're not represented directly on council. And I know that many councillors have come forward to represent people who they may not have a direct tie to, but whose cause they recognize as worthy to champion, and that's to every councillor's credit. When we talk about ties to the strategic plan and those kind of things, and again, I'm not saying that this might not be a tool that we want to put back in the toolbox. I do have a couple of concerns, though, and I do have a couple of concerns specifically with this motion when we talk about Toronto, because I look at Brampton, which I think is a more comparable size, or Ottawa, which is a more comparable size, and I think that when we look at population like Toronto, let's be honest, it's a much larger population and a much more diverse population than what we have here in London. I think if we look at Ottawa or Brampton, we might get something that's a little more comparable to the reality that we might experience in London. And I do note that both of those have dedicated staff assigned to this duty. So when we come to our strategic planning piece, we've had a lot of discussions in the last couple of weeks about the fact that we're going to have some very tough budget challenges ahead of us too. And to the mayor's point, before going ahead, I would want to know, at least have a sense of what other cities are spending on this. It might be minimal, and it might be just fine. But I think with all of the decisions that are before us, this is one where I would want to know the cost. It might be minimal, and it might be, very, very reasonable for what we're getting for it. It might not be. I don't know, because it's not in the report. So, colleagues, that'd be something that I'd like to at least see, if we're going to direct staff to report back on what other municipalities are doing for best practices. I'd also like us to include in that report back what other municipalities are spending on this. I don't think it's unreasonable to want to know what the cost is for something before we go ahead with it. So I just ask you to consider that, and I just share that in the spirit of this may well be a tool that we want to put back in the toolbox. I understand absolutely where Councillor Kaibaga is coming from with wanting to celebrate and recognize, and especially for communities that have had trouble, having that opportunity to be positive and highlight the positives is a good thing. But I just want to proceed with a little caution here. And through you, Mr. Chair, just one question to staff. With the closure coming for the Christmas holidays, is the January 6th timeline reasonable to turn around a report, or would staff need more time?
Oh, thank you very much. I'll go to our city clerk for the answer to that question.
Through Mr. Vice Chair, it is tight, but I'm assuming that you're not really looking for a fulsome report. You're just looking for a draft policy based on Toronto's policy, which would be all we would be providing. We wouldn't be providing any analysts, and we wouldn't be analyzing anything. We'd just be providing a draft policy. If there's more to it, then it would be tight, but if it's just drafting a policy, we should be able to do it.
Okay, thank you. All right, then, Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, and thank you to my colleagues for your comments. I just want to make a follow-up comment about proclamations. And from what I understand, proclamations are very ceremonial. So if we look at what we have existing, like the flag policy, the illumination policy, and the administrative policies in place, they're not ceremonial. I think Councillor Lewis said it. It's another tool to look at, and what is preventing us from looking at it, I'm not sure. That's all we're doing. We're not making decisions right now, and I feel uncomfortable about making decisions based on not having the information and looking into it, especially when I hear comments that the community is asking. So I don't have any concern about having a request come back. It's a ceremonial policy, reviewing it, looking at it. I don't know, based on a few comments that I've heard, if the mover and the seconder would be sort of open to looking at best practices, maybe like the City of London. I'm not sure, just as a few comments that, if there's other policies in place, but without making it too complicated. I understand that the City of London, it will be, City of Toronto, we're looking at that, but I'll leave it at that. I think there's nothing wrong with having a report come back to us.
Deputy Mayor Harriman.
Just two things I wanted to add. One is I hope colleagues will support the motion, give us a chance to talk about it in January. There is a Corporate Services Committee meeting on the 20th of January, so if there's some hiccup, I mean, I think there is sort of a very last ditch chance to have something change and then deal with it on the 20th. I do think that this is a reasonable way forward. The reason I'm trying to be prescriptive about let's get an alternative in front of us is because we've been talking about the issue a couple times now without really having an alternative in front of us. And I think we have to put some parameters on it. Basically, the staff report says this. It's like, look, take no action, basically, right? It's here's a receiver report. If you want to do something, tell us what it is you want us to do, right? Like we need to give some kind of parameters, so I'm trying to suggest it. I'm not picking at Toronto because it's big and therefore their policy is gonna be big. Theirs is tested with a lot of requests. So I think it probably holds up to a lot of scrutiny. They have a lot of requests. If they're issuing 180, they're probably denying a whole bunch as well along the way. And I think it's just a good model. I looked at it, it seems pretty reasonable. To me, I think it's gonna meet the kind of expectations people have in the community. So I think it's a reasonable way forward. I'm not sure if Brampton or any of these other places have a better approach. It would have been great to have, hey, here's how everyone else is handling it, kind of exhaustive listing of all the different things that are being done. We don't have that. And so I think between now and the 6th of January, if people go and look on their own at what other cities are doing and they see something that's better, I'm not to say we couldn't meld them together so that there's some elements from Toronto and something else. And I think we need to be open to that. I do want to say though that the flag raising and the illumination I think are very helpful because these are essentially the same kind of service, right? We're going to light the building up a certain color and you can ask for it and you could get it or not. And it's basically the same kind of thing. And I think that if we can do that, we can do this. And there's reputational risk both ways, right? Right now we have a reputation for we will never do proclamations. And that has its own kind of damage, right? That comes from that, which is every time someone wants a proclamation, the answer is no. Every single time. So, if they even think about it, they're like, oh, and I think people have gotten used to it. So it's probably not a huge issue right now. But I do think if we discontinue the status quo, that's going to be the situation, right? I can see a proclamation in this other city. My cousin can get a proclamation about this thing, but I can't in my own city. And I don't know that that's really what we want the situation to be. I think we can figure this out and do it in a way that's not going to be discriminatory, that's going to be inclusive. We can actually do these things. I mean, we do a lot of really complicated things in the City of London. I think this one, frankly, is not that complicated.
Are there any further comments? Then perhaps, Madam Chair, we could switch back. I'll make a comment if you would, and then we can vote.
Councillor Van Hulst.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a ceremonial thing. It's a feel-good thing. it's not a mission critical thing. I'm gonna vote against this one, simply because we've got a lot of challenges. There's groups out there that aren't getting proclamations, and there's people out in London that don't have homes. So those are the ones I'd prefer to work on. Mr. Hayward has often said, well, if you want to add something, then you're going to have to take something away. This is a very small thing, but it still requires our staff's time to even prepare this report, to do whatever is required to make the proclamations. So even if there wasn't a downside, it still requires us to spend effort on doing things that I realize people may want, but they're not the most needed things. And so I'd like us to remain focused as a council and as a corporation. And so I think I'm happy with the policy as we have it. So I'll vote against this one for those reasons.
Any other comments or questions? Councillor Morgan.
Yes, so I've listened to my colleagues' debate, and I kind of know where people stand on this, and I'll be honest, my concern here is that I agree, it can be like lighting up the building and raising a flag. In fact, I think it's a lot easier than both of those things to issue a proclamation. You just issue the proclamation, you check off the box, and then you're done with the issue. I read through the proclamations other cities are making. A lot of them seem like they're just checking off a box, and I'm not sure that that is meaningful recognition. I think we've got to do a lot more than that, and so I'm worried that us focusing too much on the proclamation part of a recognition is going to devalue the types of things that we need to be doing to recognize significant events and communities. That being said, I understand that there's a few people against and there's a few people for, and this is probably something important for us to decide on as a council. I'm not convinced that the Toronto piece is the right way to go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to support this moving forward from committee to council so that we can have a debate there about it, because it is something that impacts the whole city. It's a long-standing policy of council. Their colleagues have a direction they want to go with this, so I don't want to block it at committee and have a big debate at council. So I'm going to vote for this. I'm going to remain hesitant on this as the tool. I'm not sure that's right. We'll have a debate at council, and if it gets through and we get the policy back, I'll certainly have some questions and thoughts on it then. But I want to emphasize, I'm very supportive of us recognizing a whole range of events in the city. It's a very important role of the municipal government. For me, this is about what tools are most appropriate to do that. And I'm always hesitant about tools that can be used to just have a municipality check off a box instead of providing really meaningful recognition of important events. So I'll vote for the motion that we have on the floor today to get it to council. I'm going to think about it when we get to council, and then we'll see what happens there. But I think I'm interested in what other colleagues on council also feel about this particular issue.
Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, we'll call to vote.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 5-1.
There are no other items on our agenda, so can I get a motion to adjourn? Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Van Holst. Are we voting by? Just vote by hand. All in favor? That carries. We'll adjourn.